Hi there. Okay, so we're continuing with the anatomy and physiology of the digestive system. So this PowerPoint is going to add on a little more detail than we had yesterday with the reading and study questions. So let's get into it. Okay, so here are objectives for this lesson, and you can go ahead and read through those. And if you want to take any notes, you can take notes that relate to these objectives. Okay, so to begin, we need to distinguish between two sections of the digestive system, the GI tract and the accessory organs. So the GI tract is a long tube. So that tube starts in the oral cavity, comes down the pharynx, down the esophagus, down into the stomach. Then we get all of the small intestine, all of that. And then we go into the large intestine, and then the rectum and the anus. So all of that is one long tube. And just think of all of those organs of the GI tract. They are hollow organs. So the esophagus is a hollow tube. It's an organ. The stomach is a hollow sac. That's an organ. The small intestine and large intestines, those are each hollow tubes, which are organs, okay? So the whole GI tract is hollow, and that's where the food actually travels to, or travels along. It's traveling along that path of the GI tract, okay? GI stands for gastrointestinal. Gastro refers to the stomach, and intestinal referring to the intestines. However, the GI tract itself is not enough to do everything that needs to get done with digestion. So there are 4 helper organs, which are called the accessory organs. And those, like the same way an accessory enhances an outfit, the accessory organs enhance the activities of the GI tract. So the accessory organs are the salivary glands, the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. And basically what they do is they add additional enzymes and digestive fluids. They basically dump them in. So here's a couple of the salivary glands. They dump them in to their corresponding hollow organ. So here from the liver, we're going to dump something into the small intestine. Same from the gallbladder. And here's the pancreas, also going to dump into the small intestine. So the accessory organs are solid organs. And the GI tract organs are hollow organs, okay? So these are the ones where food passes through. And the accessory organs are the ones that add additional enzymes and digestive fluids. Okay? So we have our GI tract is our hollow organs, and then our accessory organs are our solid organs that help out. And so in terms of being able, so I will ask you on the exam to put the organs of the GI tract in order. And since it's the college class, when we put these in order, we won't just say pharynx. We'll say the 2 specific sections of the pharynx, so the oropharynx and laryngopharynx. So oropharynx is going to be right behind the mouth, so about right here. And then the laryngopharynx is going to be just posterior to the larynx, which is right here, so about right there. Then we'll go to esophagus, stomach. Instead of small intestine, we're going to list the 3 sections of the small intestine. So duodenum, jejunum, ileum, and those just go in order. Duodenum, jejunum, ileum, like Dow Jones Industrial, DJI, if you've heard of that. And then instead of large intestine, we're going to list the 5 sections of the large intestine. So that begins here with a section called the cecum. That's the initial pouch where the appendix hangs off. Then we go to ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and sigmoid colon. Okay, and then finally you would end with your rectum and anus. Okay, and then for the accessory organs, what I'm going to ask you to do is the following. So I want you to be able to So for the accessory organs, then one thing we need to be able to do is list which of the hollow organs of the GI tract the accessory organ is related to. So the salivary glands are secreting their enzymes and fluid into the oral cavity. So I'd want you to be able to say that. And then the pancreas, liver, and gallbladder, they are sending their digestive fluids into the duodenum specifically, okay? So salivary glands into the oral cavity, pancreas, liver, gallbladder into the duodenum, okay? Awesome. Okay, so now let's begin our journey through the digestive system, and we will just see what happens in each part. So we begin with the oral cavity, which is just a fancy way of saying the mouth, but we are going to say oral cavity. And there are several components in the oral cavity, as you see here, but the two I'm interested in us knowing about are the tongue. So here's the tongue right here. It's a muscle. And so the tongue helps to form the bolus of food. So the bolus of food is, let's say you're like chewing stuff up and it's getting mixed with your saliva and everything. Eventually it's going to form a little ball. So this is a little ball of chewed up food and saliva. And then the tongue is going to help push that ball back into the oropharynx, where the oropharynx will be there. It has muscles in it that kind of jump up and grab the bolus as it comes down, okay? So the tongue helps us to form the bolus of food in the oral cavity. And then the teeth are our chompers, right? Teeth are chewing, grinding. And so the term for chewing is mastication. So I do want you to know that term, mastication, for chewing. Okay? So that's the oral cavity. And then, now the oral cavity receives saliva from the salivary glands. So there's 3 pairs of salivary glands. Parotid means near the ear. So you see this gland is close to the ear. The ear is right there. Then we have sublingual below the tongue, lingual referring to the tongue. So there's the sublingual gland. And then submandibular below the mandible. So here's the mandible bone right here. It's kind of hard to tell, but this gland is deep to that, just on the inside of the mandible. So those 3 each have a duct. So this is the duct right here for the parotid gland. This is the duct for the submandibular, and I don't see the one for the sublingual. But anyway, through that duct, each gland sends saliva, which is a fluid that contains a number of items, one of which is amylase. If you remember from biology, anything that ends in ASE is almost always an enzyme. So an enzyme is a protein that speeds up a chemical reaction. So amylase is released in that saliva, so it's released into the mouth. So any sugars that you've eaten, any carbohydrates that you've eaten will begin to be processed in the oral cavity by that amylase that came from the saliva. Okay, so now we've made our bolus of food. It contains the chewed up, our bolus contains the chewed up food and the saliva. And so now our bolus moves from the tongue and it moves into the oropharynx right here in green. So there's our oropharynx there in green. So there's our bolus moving through there. And like I said, there's muscles in the pharynx that are going to help grab that bolus of food and bring it down. Then it's going to move down into the laryngopharynx, which is in the region of the larynx. So how do we prevent that bolus of food? Because here's going to be our trachea, right? And we don't want, that's where we know air needs to go. How do we stop that bolus from going down here into the trachea? Well, we have this nifty flap called the epiglottis. So there's a hole right here so as the bolus of food is coming down into the laryngopharynx, there's a hole right here. There's a space, and that space is called the glottis, okay? So that's just a hole or a space that goes into the larynx and then the trachea. So how do we prevent the bolus from going that way? How do we stop the bolus from going this way and instead knowing to go down into the esophagus? Well, we have this cartilage flap called the epiglottis, epi meaning above the glottis. So as that bolus comes along, it's going to cause that epiglottis to close over that glottis. So this will come down, it'll close over the glottis, and then that bolus will be forced to go down the esophagus. So anytime we choke, it's because somehow the epiglottis didn't close properly and food or water or fluid got into the larynx. So therefore the glottis is this hole right here, and then the epiglottis is this flap that comes down over the glottis to force the bolus to go down this way into the esophagus. So now we're in the esophagus. So this is this tube right here that connects the pharynx to the stomach. What we're interested in with the esophagus is that this is a long muscular tube, and it's going to require muscular contractions in the wall of the esophagus to move our bolus down. So basically what happens is there's a tightening, there's a squeezing, and then there's a relaxing. And then the next section is going to squeeze, and the next section is going to relax. And that same pattern of squeezing and relaxing is going to move that bolus of food down along the esophagus. And so that pattern, that rhythmic pattern of squeezing and relaxing, is called peristalsis. Okay, so peristalsis is that rhythmic contraction and relaxation of smooth muscle that moves the bolus along the esophagus down into the stomach. So the esophagus is your food tube. Okay, so now we've arrived at the stomach, and some interesting things happen in the stomach. Okay, so in the stomach, we have a group of cells called the parietal cells, okay? These cells produce hydrochloric acid, which maybe you've heard of as a pretty strong acid. The pH in the stomach is about 2 or 2.1, so that's very acidic. And so that's because the parietal cells are producing this hydrochloric acid. So these cells are going to be living in the wall of the stomach here. So now why are they producing this acid? Well, there's another kind of cells called the chief cells. Those are also living in the wall of the stomach here. And those cells produce something called pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is an inactive form of an enzyme. But we need to get that pepsinogen activated to become the active enzyme. So how do we do that? Well, it turns out that HCl is what activates that pepsinogen to become pepsin. So that's why you need the parietal cells to produce the HCl, which will then activate the pepsinogen that was produced by the chief cells. Once that pepsinogen is activated and it becomes pepsin, pepsin can begin the chemical digestion of proteins. So if you recall, the chemical digestion of carbohydrates began in the oral cavity, and the chemical digestion of proteins begins in the stomach. So what's an easy way to remember that parietal cells do hydrochloric acid and chief cells do pepsinogen? Well, the way I remember it is this is Chief of Police Wiggum, right? Chief of Police. And what is he drinking? He's drinking a Pepsi. So I just feel like in the cartoon, he always has like a coffee and a donut, but I just replaced the coffee with a Pepsi, and he's the chief of police. So if you can remember Chief Pepsi, then you know chief cells produce the pepsinogen. So then the parietal cells, the only other cells, have to produce the hydrochloric acid. And there's other cells in the stomach, but these are the two main ones we're interested in. And then finally, related to the stomach, we have a substance that comes out of the stomach. So once all the food has been churned up, so the stomach does a lot of churning. There's 3 layers of muscle here, and they do a lot of churning and mushing up and mixing of the contents of the stomach, mixing it all with that HCl and with that pepsin. And once it all comes out, once it starts to come out and go into the duodenum, it is called chyme, okay? So the stuff that comes out, the stuff that exits the stomach, that mixture of food and acid is called chyme, okay? Just so you have that term.